So, my name is Pickard. I work with Pickard, which is a purpose-driven law firm which combines business and non-profit approaches to address the social and environmental problems of today. We happen to organize this conference together with Cardiff Business School, with Hugh Wilmot and Kieran Wellman sitting to my left and right hand. And it's my pleasure and privilege to say thank you to you for coming and go through some housekeeping rules. But before I get to it, I wanted to say a couple of words about how we get to this idea of organizing this conference and basically working on the issue of the purpose of the corporation. So among other things that Framework was working on in the last couple of years, we have been engaged in the debates or in the discussions at the European Union level on corporate social responsibility. And this debate is taking place for some time now. And it became obvious to us after some time that we don't ask the most fundamental question in this debate, which is, what is the purpose of the corporation? And each of us who take part in this debate remain locked in their mental model. And that basically prevents us from having a conversation we should have, a conversation which would allow us really to understand what may be the contributions of business to society. We just keep building our ideas on the premises that have been with us for many years and that perhaps need to be revisited and reconsidered. So we started to look around, and to our surprise, we found out that the discussion is actually taking place. But the individual actors in this discussion are not connected, and they are completely disconnected from what I may call a public debate, a debate which is linked to the policy-making processes and to the processes which lead to the setup of corporate governance rules, etc. So we thought, well, we need to change it. We need to actually bring these people together. We need to get the wonderful ideas that these people have and put them in one room. Put in one room people from the business sphere, from the policymakers world, and from academia to really explore these issues. So that's what brought us here. As I said, we've been very lucky to collaborate with Cardiff Business School, who have done, Aaron and Hugh, have done a wonderful work on collating the information from the academic world, and this information is included in your conference folders in the form of the short disciplinary memos, which basically examine these questions from different perspectives. And here we are. So thank you. And now I will say a couple of housekeeping rules. So first of all, perhaps the most important, coffee will be served during the sessions. So the breaks are really short. They are not meant for you to get coffee. It will be served to you during the speeches. So that's one thing. The other thing is that we will have to move for the lunch to another room. So this will be organized. You will receive further instructions later on. The third rule, which is for the speakers, is that we need to keep our intervention strictly to 10 minutes. Otherwise, we might run into some time problems. Well, and finally, I would like to thank personally or in person to a couple of people that were absolutely crucial in making this event to happen. And first of all, I would like to thank to Member of the European Parliament, Mr. Richard Howitt, and to his wonderful staff, Sarah Walker and Robert Decker, whom you have met downstairs and who have been of great help. And I would also like to thank to a couple of people who have been volunteering and helping us, and that's Alex Marriage, who is sitting back there, and to Virginie Ruas, Jana Vychopňová, and to Natasha Dyer. And you have met these persons downstairs. They were helping you with the registrations. So I should stop here. I would like to thank to those whom I have forgotten to thank. There are many more people. And I would ask Hugh to take the word from me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Philippe. My brief is to be brief because you're not here to listen to me. I'd just like to, again, thank Richard Howitt for making this possible, and of course Frank Bold, Philippe, and Chris Halbert, who's around somewhere, as well as Cardiff Business School for supporting us in the Modern Corporation project and enabling us to contribute to this session. But thank you very much, all of you, for coming. I hope that you have some interesting conversations. I think it's very unusual to get such a diverse, multidisciplinary group of people together. And perhaps even more unusual to get a bunch of academics engaged with policy-focused deliberations. So hopefully today we'll be able to start off something that will have legs and continue in terms of re-examining the purpose of the corporation, looking at some of its theoretical and practical shortcomings and thinking about how those might best be addressed. And trying to get out of these mental models that Philip just referred to. So I promise to be brief, and I'd like to just hand over now to the people who you have come here to listen to.
Thank you, Hugh. Thank you. So, Simon, may I ask you to take the word? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippe. So, good morning, everybody. My name is Simon Pickard. I'm the Director General of ABIS, the Academy of Business in Society, which is an international business academic network based here in Brussels, but with members represented all over the world. And I think the reason for being invited to contribute here this morning is based on some reflections which started a couple of years ago within our community. Perhaps not specifically on the purpose of the corporation, but more around the future of corporate governance and how that is actually a reflection of the purpose of the firm. And these came from two separate sources. The first was a partnership we had with Vlerick Business School and the Belgian Institute of Directors to organize the 10th European Corporate Governance Conference, where we had a fascinating session involving the people who weren't producing orthodox studies and who wanted to get involved in a more esoteric and reflective debate on the nature of corporate governance and where it is headed. I think the second is the broader reflections that we've had on the nature of the role and the responsibility of business in society since the crisis. So my comments today are going to be around an argument that we first formulated a few months ago, that the future of corporate governance is dependent on three main dimensions: the societal, the behavioral, and the strategic. So I think just as sort of the context setter, I mean, at the risk of going over old ground, we all know that the financial and economic crises that started in 2008 revealed a lot of systemic fault lines in the global market economy. One of the most significant was the massive failure of corporate governance to mitigate the levels of institutional risk that had built up over the years through short-term self-interested decision-making and the pursuit of profit. For understandable reasons, in the last 5 years, the harshest spotlight has fallen largely on various actors in the financial sector, but that burden of responsibility and failure was shared across the highest levels in many industries. So, in essence, the legacy of inadequate corporate governance, we would argue, has contributed directly to the greatest destruction of economic value in modern human history. In retrospect, the existing paradigm has channeled the greatest rewards to fund managers, speculative investors, and bonus-driven senior managers, while long-term investors and other societal stakeholders have suffered the most significant losses. Beyond the numbers, this has also shifted corporate governance as a primarily instrumental activity within the firm to a field of concern for society at large. So we come back to this question of what the future of corporate governance may be, and how does that tie in with this broader discussion about the purpose of the corporation? So in a nutshell, why these three dimensions? Why societal, behavioral, and strategic? On the societal level, as we have seen, the costs of the crisis will constitute a very heavy burden, particularly here in Europe, on societies for years to come. Systemic risk remains in all global industry sectors, and the potentially dire consequences for a repeat crisis also remain. So within the context of the corporation, the role of the board in addressing corporate responsibility and public policy engagement in this societal context needs strong enhancement, and not least in industry sector governance. So that's point number one. Number two, the behavioral dimension. Given the sustainability challenges and the risks embedded in the global economy, we believe that a quantum leap improvement in the quality of corporate governance is required. Yet structural approaches to reform through regulation and codes may only result in superficial conformity and box ticking. Governance quality, we believe, is a result of behaviors and processes in terms of leadership, culture, competence, knowledge, frameworks for harnessing skills and expertise within the firm, and in the interactions between board and senior management. So in that regard, behavioral and cultural aspects are critical. Third, on the strategic dimension, we feel that the board governs the firm with respect to its purpose. The purpose of the firm has for a long time been narrowly defined as maximizing shareholder value, but we now know, and this conference is testament to it, that this has been called into fundamental question. The new school of thinking in strategic management addresses what the purpose of the firm could be in terms of long-term value creation, how value can be measured if that is not to be equaled with market price, and how governance and management processes and systems could evolve to become value-based rather than purely instrumental and compliance-driven. So digging into these in a little more detail, right, and the purpose of these observations is really to try and catalyze some thinking about how we might broaden the lens in considering the future of the governance of the firm and tying it in with its purpose. So when we consider these failures taken together, it seems that when we look through the lens of traditional corporate governance, these failures will be borne by shareholders. Yet we clearly see from the last couple of years that they have not been. Given the challenges to the economic hypotheses and theories that have contributed to the misalignment of interests between shareholders, management, and other critical stakeholders, we see a clear need for corporate governance to be more closely connected to the purpose of the firm and to deliver responsible management practices and stewardship of assets to avoid a repeat of the grave failures and mistakes that have been taking place in recent years. As a result, society itself now demands a major improvement in corporate governance that goes beyond more regulation, codes, and compliance. The erosion of trust in business and the regulatory agencies that oversee business and frame its activities has become a profound and important public debate. So it raises the question about how we deliver more effective governance mechanisms that reflect the long-term needs of society, both in terms of wealth creation, but also the stewardship of public assets, including the environment, employment, well-being, inclusion, diversity, and others. And this also raises the question of whether company boards are adequately equipped to drive progress in these areas, particularly within their industry sector. The future of the company, after all, depends on industry sector level playing fields. One of the reasons why we've been reflecting on these matters is that we feel there is a fundamental disconnect between business, government, and society. A major project which we've been running called Beyond Lobbying has basically revealed that within companies there is a poor understanding of the most constructive way to engage in regulatory and governance processes. Within policy-making bodies there is a poor understanding of how to engage with business in terms of collaborative rule setting and enhancing the rules of the game. And society is broadly excluded from both of these conversations. So the other question that this raises is the role that other societal actors and agencies could and possibly should play in delivering good corporate governance that strengthens the single market in Europe, increases competitiveness, and rebuilds public trust. So, moving on quickly to the behavioural dimension. We'd argue that the public expectations around the purpose of the firm and the future of corporate governance require a radical transformation of mindsets, decision-making processes, risk assessment, and leadership within companies and other institutions. This raises important questions with regard to the role of boards as the agents of stewardship between a company's actions and its impact on society. So under its remit to induce greater alignment between the owner and agent, a company's board has a duty to monitor and oversee the delivery of sound corporate performance within the confines of accepted rules and norms of corporate behaviour. The repeated scandals before 2008 and the subsequent crash have added ever more governance requirements based on conformance to legislation or comply and explain approaches by management and the board. But an increasing number of studies show that this volume of governance protocols has had minimum impact on the culture within organisations, and by extension, it does little to enhance board effectiveness. Instead, the particular and peculiar nature of board dynamics and the interrelationship between directors more determines governance application than centrally defined governance protocols. So in this regard, education and development to sensitize directors and managers, and arguably shareholders, towards more long-term thinking, and to convince business leaders to convert strategic choices into this long-term perspective, means that we should have more and better risk-corrected performance measures within the company. So I will focus finally on the strategic dimension, and just a placeholder for future discussion. We know that strategic thinking since the 1980s has encouraged business leaders to focus increasingly on their immediate competitive market environment. That has resulted in a growing neglect on their broader environment, including the economic, political, social, and environmental dimensions. This is combined, we would argue, with a conflation of market price and enterprise value, accounting changes that overlook intangible assets, and management approaches driven by stock price and quarterly revenue performance to dangerous effect. So 1 minute, then I'll be done. So the attractive feature of what some would argue is now a debunked or debased Anglo-American system of shareholder capitalism is the consistent model that links firm goals to governance structure, the responsibilities of boards, market for corporate control, competitive markets for inputs and outputs. But this model has lost credibility due to its links to short-termism, focus on stock market valuation, and what that resulted in terms of financial engineering, accounting manipulation, and malpractice in executive compensation. So the strategy and business decisions need to be driven by new metrics of value, whereby boards spend less time on stock market valuation and more on the expected value over the life of the firm and underlying profit drivers, plus the risk factors that determine cost of capital and flexibility factors that create options. And in closing, I would suggest that this requires the development of an entirely new model of strategic management based on business purpose and value creation, which forms the emerging agenda in the field of strategic management scholarship and will also lead to a fundamentally new era for corporate governance. And I hope that these thoughts help to inform the future conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. It's not a small ask you have, but it's why we are here in this room. So the next speaker will be Professor Paddy Ireland from the University of Bristol, from law school. So Paddy, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for inviting me here today. Last year, I moved institutions for the first time in many years and had to sort through mounds of papers and books. And amongst them were the books that I first studied when I took company law for the first time in the early 1970s. And some of the senior citizens here may be familiar with some of the titles. It was the 1968 revised edition of the Modern Corporation and Private Property, Edward Mason's Modern Corporation The Corporation in Modern Society, and Jim Gower's famous UK textbook on company law. And inevitably, I started browsing through them. Now, the ideas in these books were pretty standard fare at that time, and what they reveal are ideas about corporations and corporate law which are radically different from those prevailing today. It's a sort of veritable lost world. But as we sit here, still embroiled in the consequences of a financial crisis which was in significant part the result of the replacement of these so-called managerial theories by ideas emphasizing maximizing shareholder value, it seems to me that some of these earlier ideas are well worth revisiting because there's a great deal to be learned from them. The first thing about them, of course, is that the idea that corporations are or should be about maximizing shareholder value is entirely absent from this work. Shareholder value had not yet been invented. Indeed, the very idea that the goal of corporations should be to maximize shareholder wealth or profits is not only openly doubted, but in many of these works quite explicitly rejected. And we're talking here rejected by fairly mainstream commentators. For example, Gower, commenting on proposals aimed at trying to restore shareholder democracy and to get shareholders to act more like proper owners, he commented that this idea, with its exclusive emphasis on the profit-making element in corporate activity, is old-fashioned. The modern view is that the interests of shareholders are not the only interest that must be recognised by today's publicly held corporation. When you look at this stuff, it becomes clear that various beliefs underlay this dilution of shareholder primacy. Firstly, the belief traceable back to Burleigh means and beyond is that it's no longer appropriate to see shareholders as owners in the traditional sense of the word, either of corporate assets or of the corporations themselves. One of the things that one constantly sees in this work is the view that it's more accurate to see passive investors like shareholders as more like creditors than owners. Secondly, there's the belief that corporations wield not only huge market economic power, but also considerable social and political power, which renders them potential threats to democracy. And finally, there's the belief that it's no longer possible or appropriate to see corporations as purely private enterprises. They are better seen, more accurately conceptualized as social or quasi-social institutions with wider social responsibilities. And it's also clear that this dilution was seen not only as permissible, but as rooted in corporate law itself, specifically in the key corporate law concept of separate corporate personality. So you get agreement that the fundamental legal duty of directors is to act in the best interests of the company, but this is interpreted to mean either the best long-term interests of the shareholders, or more radically, the best interests of the company as a separate productive enterprise. Company and shareholders, in this view, are not to be treated as synonymous. The separate existence of the corporation should be taken seriously. And for these writers, it was neither appropriate or sensible to look to shareholders alone to guarantee good corporate governance. There were, of course, dissenting voices, people who wanted to reassert shareholder primacy. And it was the ideas of these people that later crystallised into the maximised shareholder value credo. There's a couple of striking things about their arguments that are worth noting. Firstly, although some of them look to a restoration of shareholder democracy to make managers more accountable, more and more of them begin to rely less on shareholder voice and more on the exercise of impersonal shareholder power in financial markets. So you begin to see growing references to the rise of institutional investors and what came to be called the market for corporate control. The second thing about them that's striking is their consequentialism. During this period, the support for shareholder primacy is based less and less on claims about corporate ownership rights and more on the socially beneficial consequences of shareholder-oriented corporations. So shareholder primacy is portrayed not as a matter of ownership, but as an empirical matter. It works. Now, I think that many would agree that corporate law and corporate governance should be judged pragmatically by results. But if they are, it seems to me, the empirical case against maximising shareholder value is overwhelming. The mechanisms which were developed to try and restore shareholder primacy, with their focus on financial market disciplines, on the realignment of the interests of managers and shareholders through stock options and so on and so forth, have led not to the primacy of the long-term committed owner, but to short-termism, to financialised corporate governance, the kind of corporate governance which underlay the financial crisis. It's also contributed to the hollowing out of firms, to the damage to their long-term productive capacities. Lower rates of growth, greater inequality. And it hasn't dealt with the problem of managerial accountability. One only has to look at executive pay to see that what we appear to have is almost a collusion between managers and shareholders. Managers are allowed to engage in rent seeking. Ironically, many of the managerialists writing in the 60s and 70s would have found this entirely predictable. Because one of the other striking things in their work is their scepticism and even disdain for these emerging ideas about re-establishing shareholder democracy. Trying to get shareholders to act like real owners, many of them argue, is just trying to turn history backwards. It's just not feasible. Bayless Manning, an American commentator, said, attempts to restore shareholder primacy is a diversion that stands in the way of genuine reform. And in any case, far from being a good thing, a return to an exclusive focus on maximising shareholder wealth is regressive. It's no longer justifiable, nor socially and economically desirable. They also express considerable doubts about the ability of takeovers to weed out inefficient management. They look instead to Keynes, arguing that it was more likely to lead to the short-termism that he described. Now, I've recalled these ideas not a nostalgia or indeed a desire to put history into reverse, because indeed that was precisely the accusation they made at the emerging law and economists who wanted to restore shareholder primacy by whatever means. I recall them because it seems to me that for all their flaws, these analyses are much richer, more sophisticated, more nuanced than those which have followed. There's no resort to simple or facile theories and easy solutions, efficient capital market hypotheses. There's a recognition of the complexity of the policy issues involved and of their social, legal, political and economic dimensions. There's also recognition of the economic realities surrounding the modern corporation, their huge power, the rentier nature of shareholding, the problems of managerial accountability that flow from that. You can't rely on shareholders or shareholders alone for good corporate governance. So let me conclude with some extracts from the first text from which I taught company law, which was Gower's Modern Company Law, the 1979 edition. Gower argued that English company law was in a considerable state of disarray, and there was a need for a reconsideration of many of its fundamentals. He wrote, the legal reforms which had begun in the 1960s were intended as a first instalment of a more comprehensive legislation which would introduce wide reforms in the structure and philosophy of our company law, and a re-examination of the whole theory and purpose of the public company, and of the comparative rights and obligations of shareholders, directors, creditors, and employees, and the community as a whole. Unfortunately, he said, nothing of this sort has emerged. It still hasn't, and I think it's time that it did. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, it's my pleasure to introduce the last speaker of this panel, Mr. Robert Madelin, who's the Director General of the DG Communications, Networks, Content and Technology. So, Robert, please, the floor is yours.
So, thank you. One of the main pleasures of being invited to this is I get to listen to expertise from a field that's not my own, so I hope the audience will be similarly indulgent with the few things I can say in 10 minutes. If I start with 1979, that was the year I joined the British Department of Trade and Industry as a public servant, since which I spent 15 years working for Her Majesty's government and since then 20 for the Commission, or to look at it a different way, 10 years working in London and 25 years here in Brussels. And so I want to offer a few thoughts in 5 headings as a sort of, I would say, a practitioner practitioner in fields of trade policy, health, innovative regulation for the life sciences and for information technology, as a practitioner in the field of cooperating with corporations around public policy goals. And if I can start with three warning remarks. I think the first is that if we want to make a difference here, we have to certainly have a visionary long-term goal that can be radical, but if we, in a town like this, preach the radical, perfect vision, nobody will be turned on to help take the first two steps. The second point, I think, is, and I come at this from an apolitical perspective, in analysing what the situation is and what needs to be done. If we talk to people who wouldn't come to a meeting like this with a lot of adjective-laden, divisive labels, that would also turn them off. And thirdly, and again it's a warning to us in a room like this, we care about this, but we shouldn't believe that out there this is seen as the big issue. So there's a very hard road of conviction and positioning to be conceived before the majority, let's say, of voters in European Parliament elections want to know what the candidate's view is on the purpose of the corporation. So I think we have to be very determined. I personally believe this is crucial to success in public policy, but also quite careful in planning a strategy. So the two first points then of my five would be about the evidence base. And my first proposition is that there is a solid evidence base that strategic alignment between corporate and social purpose is a win for shareholders and for corporations. And the evidence that I have been satisfied to use as the basis for the last 20 years of my job has been that basically there are three steps to nirvana. Most companies understand they have to defend reputation when attacked. That won't do it. Second step, most companies these days also understand they have to advertise how nice they are and invite trust, but that won't do it either. What most companies are only beginning to understand is that cooperation with other bits of societies in which they are having an impact, join us, can help to better produce that alignment. The second bit of evidence, which I think is pretty clear, is how to do this for fun and profit. In other words, if a corporate board wanted to do this, they're not inventing on a blank piece of paper, they're not working in a vacuum. And again, there are three steps to nirvana. Firstly, and this is the one where corporate lawyers usually prevent success, get all those who think they have an issue, a stake in the problem, to come into the room and talk to them. And at that stage, most lawyers say, well, let's work out first what the plan is. Secondly, set some goals and some performance indicators. Do not try to get consensus in the room, but start prototyping. And then thirdly, because you're starting without consensus, accept that you have to be accountable to those who were in the room in the first place, where you underperform against your indicators, which you certainly will, because every organisation is a human organisation, but commit to repeated learning attempts to do better. So I think the evidence is pretty clear, and then if the evidence is so clear, what's the problem? So my third point is that because the evidence is contested by well-established, well-understood interest groups and contested by people who haven't thought about it, we need a strategy to make the evidence-based approach aspirational. And changing the law is only one, and I think the longest and least sure way of doing it. You need political leadership, you might need tax breaks, and you certainly need, and there I would agree with the first speaker, more skillful engagement from other actors in society. Final points. Can Europe help, and what about the world? What about the world? This is a global issue. There's a whole theory out there which I shan't unpack around transnational neo-pluralism. So this thing is a challenge not just for corporations and company law, but for intergovernmental relations and the law of nations. You see that on internet governance, so watch the events in Sao Paulo in April, and you see it around collective state oversight of stuff like spying, so you can see that any day in the Guardian newspaper. Lastly, can Europe help? We've supported CSR, but CSR can only be on the first step to nirvana. So we don't have a challenging enough view of CSR. We are trying to set principles which encapsulate the evidence for co-regulatory initiatives, so companies get public support from the Commission if they do it the right way. We now need, I think, to put effective corporate cooperative techniques into our impact assessment mechanisms so that they can crowd out otherwise, I think, simplistic demands for legislation in some areas. And finally, we need to test collectively across Europe how to make the rest of society able to accompany and challenge corporations in such a journey.